For people who are accustomed to thinking of literal biblical interpretation as being fundamental in some way with respect to Christian history, figures like Origen, I think, are going to make that a bit more problematic. Let's talk about Origen. Origen is an interesting and controversial figure in the history of Christianity. And one of the things that's easy for us to forget in considering his ideas is just how close he was historically to the writing of the later Christian scriptures, the later portions of the New Testament. So the portions of the canon that we, still read today and think of as being very, very ancient, for Origen would have been very recent history. And so we're at a point in time in which Christianity is still being worked out in the details. And so, in light of that, we see a number of ideas that it's interesting that we're seeing them already at this point in Christianity, and it's interesting that many of them continue on and become part of basically an established tradition. Now, Origen, of course, as well, was controversial because not all of his ideas did become canonical in the way that some of them would. And so, some of what he had to say, even though his writings were very popular, were ultimately going to be problematic in later years. Now, to begin with, one of the things that he insists upon in his exegesis is the spiritual and allegorical meaning of Scripture. And this is to say specifically that the literal interpretation of Scripture is not always appropriate, and he means by this not the historical, in other words, that you have a particular passage that ostensibly refers to something historical but either can't or doesn't for whatever reason, and Origen is still going to insist upon a spiritual or allegorical, some kind of deeper meaning in the text. And this is, of course, part of a long tradition, one that continues on, as I've mentioned before, into the Middle Ages and beyond. And it's really only recently that we've started to move away from this somewhat. So I think it's instructive for people who are accustomed to thinking of literal biblical interpretation as being fundamental in some way with respect to Christian history. Figures like Origen, I think, are going to make that a bit more problematic in showing that there is a tradition of doing this kind of interpretation for a very long time. So, that being the case, Origen is a Platonist in many regards, and his version of Christianity is very much Platonic. And this manifests in a number of different places, mostly with regard to the forms. But also in Plato's Republic, the idea of God being beyond being itself. And this is something that's going to be picked back up by later Christian theologians as well as being important. And this is certainly one way of avoiding pantheism, for example, in insisting that God is beyond all being itself. And so not just a part of being itself, but actually beyond it and or prior to it. Now, with respect to the forms, one of the things that Origen is going to say that will be controversial is that the forms that informed creation, that were used as a kind of blueprint for creation, where the archetypal ideas for creation exist in eternity. And so, in a certain sense, the reality of the individual things and the reality of creation is eternal, but not as creation. So it's going to be eternal as the forms are eternal for Plato, outside of time. Okay, now with evil, his notion of evil is going to be very similar as well to what we get in Plato. And if you recall, for Plato, evil and badness are not forms. They are the absence of or imperfections of forms. And so goodness is a form, it is the form, but badness is not a form. So you don't have a kind of God and anti-God sort of thing going on. You have a God, more or less, with the form of the good. And you have falling away from that God insofar as contemplation, knowledge, moves away from knowledge of the good. This is one way of characterizing Platonism, and it's certainly going to be one way that was resonant with the Neoplatonists. And so Origen really even predating, some of the work there. So again, it's fascinating to see some of this stuff just so early. So evil for Origen is a fall away from perfect contemplation. And so McGinn makes much of contemplation, and of course we do see this a lot in Origen, and he calls him a good Greek for doing this. But we have to remember what knowledge means in this sense. And knowledge for a Platonist, and especially for someone like Origen, is going to be a commingling with the object. And so knowledge is not just a knowledge of something. It's not just that I have my own ideas about what something is, but the thing maintains its own independent existence. In fact, instead, by knowing something, I actually participate in it in a substantive way. So I'm not just looking at something, but I'm actually becoming it by understanding it. And so this is a much more thoroughgoing and, one is tempted to say ontological version of knowledge, whereby what one is changes in proportion to what one knows. And so this is carried through not only with prosaic examples in terms of, well, if you know something bad, or if you consort with things that are rough and bad in the world, then you are going to become that. If you consort with things that are good and holy, you're going to become that. But even more than this, if you know God, then you become God. And so there is a mysticism in Origen, and Origen is a favorite among mystics for this, among other reasons. And so he's willing to talk about this and to talk about henosis, to talk about unity, so unification with the divine. And this is a note that sounds throughout his works. Now, McGinn says kind of curiously in this regard, because McGinn has an axe to grind with respect to unification, and he wants to maintain the creature and created separation and insist upon that separation being important for Christianity. There seems to be a certain sense in his writings that if that were allowed to collapse, then Christian dogma and theology and the exclusive claim to truth would also collapse. I'm not sure that has to be the case, and there are a number of Christian theologians that don't seem to think that that's the case. But nevertheless, this is part of the tone that you're going to see there. So there are two different claims that he makes towards the end of the Origen section that are not entirely clear by the text, and I think that's probably the most charitable thing that we can say, because otherwise we might say that they're not supported by the evidence, which I don't know if that's necessarily the case or not. I'm not an expert on Origen, but suffice to say that the material that he presents in the selection does not seem to fully justify the conclusions that he draws. And the two that I have in mind are with respect to ecstasis and enthusiasmos. So this is the ecstasy, literally standing outside of oneself, used to describe kind of trance-like states and rapture and this sort of thing. And enthusiasmos, which literally means being possessed by a god, being enthusiastic, but being possessed by a god, no longer being oneself and actually becoming something else, having the divine infuse you, take you over in some way. So he says that these are not to be understood in terms of ecstasy and not to be understood in terms of trance and more extreme states. And it's not clear why this is the case. And as well, because, if Origen is using these terms, and you've got to remember this is during a time when the mystery religions would have still been using them. They would have still been active, very active, in ancient Rome. And so it's not clear. If he wanted to differentiate himself from that tradition, then, surely he should have used different words. So it's not clear why it is that he used those words if he didn't mean for them to be taken in that way. So I'm not quite sure what McGinn has in mind there. And the other is with kenosis, with unity, and the unification with God. And he says that Origen talks about this a lot, but that he also wants to maintain a creature-created distinction. And that might be the case, but it might be the case as well in the same way that we see with people like Meister Eckhart, where, you have a creature-created distinction. Insofar as something is a creature, then it is not the creator. Insofar as it is a creature, it is ephemeral. In other words, as a creature, it is something that is bound in time. This is a very kind of ancient Platonic conception, right? So as a manifestation of the forms, clearly it is not the forms, insofar as it is a contingent manifestation, something that is born and will pass away at some point. But at the same time, it is also linked to its existence, what Eckhart called esse virtualiter, its virtual existence, its virtual essence in the form itself. And the form, of course, is eternal and is, one with the divine. So that Origen maintained such a distinction, he could do so like Eckhart, and we could still have unity in the same way that Eckhart seems to want. So again, I think those two things probably indicate more of what McGinn has in terms of an axe to grind rather than anything else. But there it is. So Origen, in essence, for us, represents a kind of transitional period. This is a formational period for Christianity, and one where the orthodoxy is coming to be established. And so this is going to predate some of the important councils that decided upon Christian dogma. So with Origen, we have a bit more free form and a fluid form of Christianity than what we're going to see later. So another aspect, and this is the closing bit for Origen, his notion of love. When later, not just mystics, but in Christianity in general, there's a lot of talk about love and knowledge. And there's a famous formulation, the famous dictum, amor ipsa notitia est. So love itself is a form of knowledge. Love itself is a form of knowing. And this is something that McGinn says that Origen could have agreed with, even though he didn't actually use, this particular formulation. But I think it might be more accurate to say that love and knowledge themselves were not separate as much, especially for Origen, but maybe even during this time more broadly, than they would be later, because that formula comes a couple of centuries later. And there's some development in there that's worth talking about in terms of culture and movement away from this Platonic notion of knowledge. And this is one of the things that characterizes this period from the birth of Christianity into the medieval times, where we have this movement away from knowledge meaning a participation in the thing that's known. So for the ancient Greeks, for Plato certainly, to know something was to participate in it, was to mingle with the thing itself, to become it. And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, to know something then is to change what you are. And this is going to slowly morph over time into the form of knowledge that we are more familiar with. And so for someone like Origen, it would not have been necessary to say that love is a form of knowing, because love and knowing are already naturally together. And one of the things that he recognizes, and one of the things that he says, which is kind of interesting, is that just as John says agape, he could say eros. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in the New Testament, you don't see the word eros in Greek, which is really, it's really interesting, and it seems clearly deliberate. And this is one thing that McGinn points out, where he notes this and says, this has to be significant, that they are trying to avoid some of the connotations perhaps that are associated with philosophy of that time in talking about eros. And so eros for Plato and for Origen is going to be, a kind of demigod. It's something that must be divine because it leads us back to the divine. And this is going to be very much the way that love is spoken of in the Christian tradition for, this is many, many centuries. So Origen is kind of the fountainhead in some regard for this with regard to love and erotic mysticism. And the language of eros is something that he advocates for and will, in some respects, make okay for others to do as time progresses. And so there's a long tradition of doing this, and especially using the Song of Songs in speaking of an erotic union with the divine. And so all of the language of eros and even of sexuality is used to this end. And you might be surprised to find the extent to which this happens, including what happens in the Middle Ages. We're accustomed to thinking the Middle Ages is very conservative, but then you have this just, overflowing of erotic imagery in love poems and love writings and whatnot by various, devotional people in the Middle Ages with respect to Christ, with respect to the divine. And so this is not the kind of thing that we're accustomed to seeing now, but nevertheless there's a long tradition of it, and that tradition more or less can trace back to someone like Origen. Now, Simone Weil has an interesting comment on this. She is a 20th century mystic, and one of my favorite intellectuals from that period, incidentally. She's very much worth reading. But she comments on this and says, to reproach mystics with loving God by means of the faculty of sexual love is as though one were to reproach a painter with making pictures by means of colors composed of material substances. In other words, you can't fault somebody for using for making a painting out of paint. If that's the stuff that you have to use, that's the stuff you have to work with, so naturally you're going to form your art out of that substance. And so if erotic love is the kind of, substance that we have to work with, then, well, I mean, there it is. Now, this is part of a tradition that, and I'm sure she realized this, tracing back to especially Augustine, who's later, in thinking of the mind is naturally drawn toward sensible things, as naturally thinking in terms of sensible things. And there's even a philosophy of language tradition in the 20th century that draws upon this essentially and says, hey, by the way, the language has to be based upon experience, has to be based upon what we have, all of the sense experience that we have from birth. What else do we have to use? So surely we're going to make use of all the different tools available, and sexual love is going to be a powerful one, so why shouldn't it appear? That's effectively the same kind of thing here. Now, Augustine is well going to say this in a bit tamer terms, because he's not just talking about sex, he's talking about all sorts of worldly metaphors, in saying that, well, we have to use worldly metaphors, we have to use worldly imagery and concepts in talking about the divine, because that's all we have. And so we have to begin with the sensible world and then progress from there. And for Augustine, of course, this is progressing interiorly and moving into understanding the knowledge, ourselves as image of God and so on. But there's no reason then to exclude any kind of sensible intuition or concept, including sexuality. And so, anyway, this is merely to say that with the original New Testament writings, you find an avoidance of the word eros. With Origen, he says, why don't we use eros? It seems very appropriate. Now, he is more of a traditional Platonist, so again, this is very appropriate for him. And eros is ultimately going to be the force that leads us back to a unification with God for Origen.